Hi there. Thank you for inviting me to give a talk this weekend. My name is John Wells. I'm a research genetic counsellor. I've just recently completed my master's in genetic and genomic counselling at Cardiff University. And I'm going to talk a little bit about my dissertation project, which was a project I ran in collaboration with Alex TLC, based around the topic of family communication following a diagnosis of adrenoleukodystrophy. But before I get into that, I'm just going to briefly start with an introduction to genetic counselling kind of more broadly, because I'm conscious that that's not necessarily a kind of profession or a service that everyone watching this video will be aware of or will have interacted with before. So, there we go. So what is genetic counselling? So the professional definition is that genetic counselling is well, it's a communication process to help people understand and adapt to the medical, psychological, and familial implications of genetic contributions to disease. So genetic counsellors are trained healthcare professionals who also have particular knowledge and skills and understanding in genetics and healthcare, but also have counselling skills as well to help support families to kind of come to terms with that genetic information, which can sometimes be quite difficult. So just to take it a step back again, what do we really mean when we're talking about genes and genetic disease? Well, our genes act as our instructions. They essentially instruct our bodies how to grow and how to function. And as humans, we have between 20 and 25,000 genes. And each one of those, or most of those genes, they produce something. They produce a protein. Which has a specific role to play in our body. So it's it does something. And genes are passed from parents to offspring. And they contain the information needed to specify traits. So things like eye color, hair color, for example, they're kind of traits that you might think of. So genes really, they are the basic unit of inheritance. And some other terms that you might come across when kind of talking about this kind of thing, genes are made out of a material called DNA, and they are stored on structures in our cells, which are called chromosomes. So I've just taken this image from the genomics education program just to demonstrate this. So in the top right here, we have a cell within our body. And with each in our cell, we have these structures. We have 46, in fact, of these structures, 23 pairs of these structures called chromosomes. And chromosomes are made out of DNA, which is a long molecule, which is wound together and compacted in these chromosomes so it can fit inside cells, fit inside our cells, really. And certain segments of this DNA will be a certain gene. So there will be a section which produces a protein which has a role to play in our body. So just to kind of bring this to leukodystrophies and make this relevant, so the ABCD1 gene, for example, that's the gene that's associated with X-linked adrenoleukodystrophy, and these other genes here linked with some leukodystrophies that you might be aware of. This diagram, which I've taken from ALD Info, I won't go into detail because I'm people much more knowledgeable about kind of the pathogenesis of, say, adrenoleukodystrophy than I am, but it's just to make the point, really, that if you've got a cell in which a gene, so in this case, the ABCD1 gene isn't quite working as it should, so the product that makes, something here called ALDP, ALD protein, that has a job to do, and that job is to take these molecules called very long chain fatty acids into a certain compartment where they can be degraded. Now, if that molecule isn't working properly, isn't doing what it should, then those very long chain fatty acids build up and can become toxic and causes the issues that we know are associated with adrenoleukodystrophy. So just to make the point, really, that when we're talking about genetic disease, often we're talking about these conditions where a gene with an alteration, a pathogenic alteration, so a disease-causing alteration, means that the product it's making isn't quite doing what it should and can lead to genetic disease. What do genetic counsellors do? Well, because genes are the unit of inheritance, genetic information is different to other aspects of medical information in that it's relevant not just to an individual, but to their family members as well. And we'll come on to this and much more when talking about my dissertation project. So often genetic counselors, well, they gather information from patients about their family history and medical history to assess the chance of a disease occurring. So they'll take something called a pedigree, which is this diagram you can see here in the top right. They listen to questions and concerns that patients and their families have about genetic conditions, the possibility of genetic conditions. They support patients and their families to make informed decisions. So you can test for some genetic conditions. You can have diagnostic tests, which is where an individual might be displaying symptoms and you want to find out what the cause of those symptoms are, so you want to diagnose it. You can also have predictive tests where you can find out if someone is likely to be at an increased chance of developing the disease, or if they are going to develop a disease, depending on the condition. So you can see this is maybe where some of those counselling skills come into play, because you're helping, as a genetic counsellor, you're helping families to not only understand this information, which can be quite complex, but consider it in their own lives to facilitate them to make decisions about testing, about reproduction, for example, that are right for them and their situation, whatever that may be. And you're helping patients to understand that diagnosis, what it might mean for themselves and their family. I mean, it's quite genetic counsellors do a huge amount of things. That's just very top line, but it gives you a sense of the kind of conversations that a genetic counsellor might have with a patient and their family members. And within the UK, most genetic counsellors work within clinical genetic services, so within hospitals. And in these roles, they work very closely with clinical geneticists. So these are doctors who are specialists within genetics. So clinical geneticists and genetic counsellors work very close together, and also work closely alongside different specialisms like oncology, cardiology, pediatrics, neurology, and so on. Some charities and specialist support groups and things also have their own genetic counsellors with quite in-depth knowledge of certain conditions or certain subset of conditions. Also research posts like myself, and increasingly genetic counsellors in private healthcare as well. So now that that's a quick background of, I guess, what I mean when I say genetic counsellor and genetic counselling, just moving on a bit to the piece of research that I've been conducting over the last year with Alex TLC. So the title of this is a qualitative study exploring family communication following a diagnosis of adrenoleukodystrophy in the UK. And I appreciate that Alex TLC have a broader remit than just adrenoleukodystrophy, but that was the condition that I was focusing on for my dissertation project. And really just to give a background to where this came from, the genesis of this project. So this is a quote from Sarah Hunt, the CEO of Alex TLC. She said that many families report a lack of follow-up genetic counselling following a diagnosis of adrenoleukodystrophy, often leading to the index case family being left to inform the extended family. As the majority of index case diagnoses are terminal and these families are experiencing the most devastating circumstances, index families are often ill-equipped to meaningfully communicate the seriousness of the diagnosis and the need for further testing to the extended family. So based on her knowledge from interacting with the members, from feedback in member surveys and that kind of thing, Sarah and the team were aware that many families within the network, they find this difficult. Receiving an ALD diagnosis is really hard, and then having that communication with other relatives saying that there might be further testing that need to be done, they found it really difficult. And I think the initial idea was to get a sense of, well, what do genetic counsellors know, what do doctors know about adrenoleukodystrophy? And we thought, well, actually, the best thing to probably do is to just really explore this a bit further. If we can really understand those challenges, why it's so hard, what the people who've experienced it, what kind of support they would like, then maybe we can use that as an evidence base to kind of, I guess, improve the genetic counselling profession going forward. So we all agreed that this was a good idea. So really, just to summarise the rationale for why this is an important piece of research is that, as we said, a genetic diagnosis has implications not only for an individual, but for their biological relatives as well. And because of that, family communication is actually a really well-studied topic. However, it's a well-studied topic with respect to certain genetic conditions, including hereditary cancer syndromes and inherited cardiac conditions. However, there's almost no literature at all exploring the experiences of families who've received a diagnosis of ALD and how it's been for them, how receiving that diagnosis has been, how communicating that diagnosis to their relatives has been. So that doesn't really exist in the literature. And ALD has its unique set of characteristics, things like prognosis, mode of inheritance, the age of onset, lots of things which it has its own profile, its own disease profile. So it warrants looking at it, specifically, rather than just assuming that the learnings that have been made from looking at other conditions can be applied to it. And as I've said, insights from the study could therefore help guide future genetic counselling practice. So what was the aim of this piece of study then? Well, it's a very explorative study. So the idea being to really better understand the psychosocial impacts of receiving a diagnosis, to explore the experiences of those who've received an ALD diagnosis for themselves or for their children in communicating it with their relatives. And I should just say at this point, this includes the different phenotypes or different subsets of ALD. So we're talking about AMN here as well. Explore perceptions of how genetic counsellors might best facilitate the process of family communication following diagnosis. So ask people who've experienced it, how they would have best been supported, and establish an evidence base that can be used to guide future genetic counselling practice. So methods, so how to go about this? Well, I worked with LXTLC to recruit members of my target population, which was adults who received an ALD diagnosis, or the parents of children who received an ALD diagnosis within the UK. And I conducted semi-structured interviews. So because this is such an exploratory piece of work, the idea is to really get deep, kind of detailed and nuanced insights into people's thoughts and opinions and reflections and emotions. So the best way to do that is to ask them, to kind of, to speak to them and try and better understand that, as opposed to something with a survey where you might be restricting that much more. And what we mean here by semi-structured is that there are certain topics and areas that I wanted to discover, but actually to kind of discuss and discover more about, but actually the idea is to leave some freedom and some flexibility for participants to talk about what is most important to them and what they think the most important bits are. And then I analyze this data, the methodology kind of called it thematic analysis, which is essentially where you read the data, or you transcribe the interview and then you reread it and you read it again and you read it again, and you really get into that data and really understand it and the nuance in it, and really just dig into what people are saying and what they're saying as they speak. And you compare this amongst different participants and contrast it to identify those themes and patterns which are relevant to what we was trying to find out, to those research aims that I've just been through. So this gives an idea of the type of questions. This is just a few examples of the types of questions I was asking people. So as you can see, very open. Can you tell me about how the diagnosis came about? What were you told? Who told you? What happened after that? What did you tell your family? How did you feel about it? So very open questions, and people took this in different directions. It was my role to kind of facilitate that and generate as much information as I could. And very thankful to those participants for sharing those detailed and very personal accounts with me, which turned out to be incredibly insightful. So moving on to the results, I interviewed 7 people in the end. I was able to recruit 7 people. As you can see here from this table, 4 of those participants were women who's had a son, or one or more son who'd been diagnosed with the childhood cerebral form of ALD. 3 were males who'd received their own diagnosis for themselves as an adult. And I've just included this slide to give you a sense of what the data analysis looks like. So this is an extract from one of the interview transcripts. So you can see here, I say, well, do you remember those initial conversations once you'd received the initial diagnosis for your son? And the participant says, yeah, so talking to my brother, he obviously was devastated for us. That kind of goes without saying. Obviously, he was concerned, I've got 3 girls, and what if they have boys, that sort of thing. And I said, actually, it's more likely that it's come from dad. So, in that case, they wouldn't be at risk. Obviously, he was still very concerned, and so on. So what you do is you've spoken to this participant, and then you type it up, and then you kind of read this. And as you read it, you get a sense of what's the participant saying here? What have they said very explicitly? What have they maybe alluding to, but it's kind of a bit more between the lines? And if you've got 7 or 8 interviews, each between 50 minutes and an hour and a half or so, you can see how you generate a huge amount of data that people that gives insights into people's experiences. So some of the initial notes I put on this transcript when first reading it was that so this participant's son, they'd received a diagnosis for adrenal leukodystrophy. Obviously, she says her brother was, of course, devastated by that. But then, quickly the conversation turned to his thoughts about his own family, his own immediate family. He has daughters, and what if they have boys? What does it mean for them? And you can see now how the participant's role here almost flips quite quickly, no longer on the, receiving, I guess, sympathy, but suddenly taking a role of explaining the condition to her brother and saying, well, actually, maybe if it comes from dad, because of how it's inherited, then they wouldn't be at risk. So they're taking on that role to kind of explain that. And her brother's maybe not convinced by what she said, but anyway, you can see how this is quite nuanced, and how, and in this participant's accounts of her family communication following the diagnosis, there's a huge amount that you can read into it and pick out from it. And if you do that and continue to do that, when you end up with something like this called a thematic map. Now, what I did is I came up with 3 key sub-themes, which I think represented the data that I uncovered in my interviews. So the first one is called the vicissitudes of diagnosis. And you can see I've tiered it here with lots of interconnecting sub-themes and things like that. But what they was really trying to capture is that the way participants spoke about receiving diagnosis was, it was life-changing. World suddenly turned upside down. Life before and life after that point weren't the same. Are characterized, unfortunately, by a huge amount of trauma, and I've broken that down further into how people detailed that. And I'll go into that now, actually. So I've just picked up a few quotes from various transcripts, just to give you an idea of the kind of things that some people said. And it's worth saying that in a thematic map like this, these aren't necessarily nice, neat boxes. People's ideas and views, they contrast, they bleed into one in each other, but it gives you a sense of the kind of things that people were saying. So these quotes I picked out aren't supposed to be all encompassing or anything. They just give an idea of the kind of things that participants were saying. So they spoke about be informed, how they were informed about the diagnosis, in this case in their son. It was just absolutely horrendous. He came back in, he being the healthcare professional, he came back in with son 1 and said, you've just got to take him home and love him. So this idea that they were given, all hope sounds as though it was taken away in that moment, with the way that was told. People spoke about being in shock, partly because because of the rarity of the condition, they hadn't heard of it before. So receiving, say, a diagnosis of childhood cerebral ALD, not knowing what that meant, the poor prognosis attached to that was shocking to them. A few participants specifically spoke about how hard it was to go home after that, to go home from the hospital. Husband got to the car and physically threw up in the car park because of the shock. A few people said things similar to that. The train journey being a blur, I can't remember how I got home, that kind of thing. Some people spoke about being in denial. Here, this lady spoke about how her son was running around like a Fruit Loop in the hospital, chatting with all the nurses, being a bit of a flare. And we sort of thought, well, how can he possibly die within 6 months? This just isn't right. This just can't be right. So what they were seeing in their son just didn't match up with this really difficult diagnosis that they've just received. And some people spoke about entering a period of denial. They just didn't think that was right. A couple of the women specifically due to the fact that adrenal leukodystrophy is an X-linked inherited condition. I haven't really gone into chromosomes, but that means that females are carriers of the condition, so they aren't affected to the same way as males are, but they can pass on the condition to boys who then tend to be affected. And this participant, all I was told really is that I was the carrier. It wasn't a combination of me and my ex-husband, it was me. So in her account, this alludes to the fact that the way she was told, it was on her. She was the carrier. It wasn't to do with her ex-husband. So you can see how this closely links in with feelings of guilt and blame, and a few of the accounts spoke about this. Fear and uncertainty was really a common theme for different reasons, because it's a very variable condition in terms of how it's expressed. So the same change in the gene and the ABCD change can manifest very differently in different people. That led to fear in parents who didn't know how it was going to manifest in their children, into adults who didn't know how it was going to progress in themselves. Because of the age of onset is maybe 3, 4, 5. A few of the participants, I think all 4 actually of the mothers that I spoke to already had a second son, as it happened, by the time they received this diagnosis in their first son. So there's feelings of fear and uncertainty. They've just read this diagnosis, and then straight away, well, has my second son got it? What does this mean for them as well? And as one participant put it, it's like you've got a sword of Damocles hanging over your head. You just don't know what is going to happen in the future. And loneliness as well was another theme that came up. This quote specifically talking about friendships, that they in her experience, they either ask too many questions or they turn around and run to the hills because they don't know what to do. So in this period of trauma, of grief, that you kind of lose these relationships as well, was really, really challenging. Again, and you see how these things are interconnecting, and they link to one another, but it gives you a sense of just how difficult that point of diagnosis is. There was also hope in that. So within this kind of vicissitudes, this kind of ups and downs, for some people, receiving that diagnosis was a relief. So this quote's from a male participant receiving a diagnosis for himself, who'd been noticing over recent months and years, losing his balance, not being able to do things quite as he did before. And his health, talking about his healthcare professional, he thought it would come as devastating news for me. And I was over the moon, because finally I was getting, because I knew there was a problem. The problems were already there. I wanted to know what exactly it was. So finally I was getting a diagnosis, is kind of what he went on to say, is that huge relief when he finally was able to put a name, AMN, onto these symptoms that he'd been experiencing. The fact that he could share that with colleagues and friends and family, go, no, this is what it is. I know what it is now. So there's relief in that. And because of the very variable expression of the condition, been with gratitude among some participants that they or their sons wasn't as bad as it could have been, as they'd seen it be in other people when they Googled it, when they looked for information, when they went to events and things, and hoped that it wouldn't progress to be as challenging as they've seen it been for other people. So really, really complex emotion. The second sub-theme was this idea of negotiating new roles and responsibilities. So once you've received this diagnosis, despite being this in a very difficult period of adversity, people felt they now had responsibilities to inform their family, to protect their family. For some, it felt like a burden, just because they've received a diagnosis, and not only are they dealing with that, they now feel as though they're the person who's actually got to be an expert in that. Their family members are going to ask them questions about it. What does it mean? What does it mean for me? And they've been cast in this role as an expert. And as this participant said, she didn't really know about it at all. People spoke about their boundaries, so who they felt responsible to inform. For some, it was everyone that they knew biologically related to them. They felt, no, this is my duty to inform them. For others, they felt it was maybe their duty to inform their immediate family, and those natural hierarchies and communication channels that we all have in families. Word all spread out from there. So as this participant put it, yeah, all my cousins and everyone, they all knew. I mean, it's like jungle drums, really. So kind of alluding to the fact it was out of her control. The information was just part of the family conversation now. And then in terms of the role of healthcare professionals, participants had mixed views about the roles that healthcare professionals should play. In this example, this participant, I remember her speaking about the straw that broke the camel's back. So it's such a difficult time when she received a diagnosis for her son. If she had to go on and tell her family as well, it was just one thing too many. She wouldn't have been able to do it. I can't imagine being that person that has to phone someone and tell them, my children have just been diagnosed with adrenal leukodystrophy and your children might have it too. So in this case, her health professionals had taken some of that off her and been proactive, and for her that really helped in that way. And then, just conscious of the time, very quickly you'll see this changing relationships. I've kind of part as a, I guess, enveloping everything else. Lots of participants spoke about relationships strengthening between them and their partner, them and their siblings, as they kind of came together around this diagnosis and worked it as a family. Some spoke about relationships weakening, perhaps when they disagreed about how the next best step, or lost friendships, as we've already spoke about, that kind of thing. So in this very difficult time of adversity, of having these new responsibilities fulfill, not only that, but it's a time of changing relationships as well. So a huge amount of detail in there. Oh, and I missed the responsibility to protect, but I'll very quickly do it now. So non-disclosure. So for some people, specifically parents talking to their children, we're talking about informing here, but actually the need to protect also leads to people not informing, not talking about the condition. Because as this lady put it, well, I don't think we specified for months what it actually was, because how could I tell a 9-year-old that he's got something he could die of, or that he might have something? So in order to protect them from this very difficult condition, they didn't speak. Similarly, protecting from society. So this participant didn't inform many friends and social networks because they didn't want their son to be treated differently. So again, didn't disclose it for fear of protecting them, in order to protect them. Interestingly, another participant, in order to want to, I guess, protect her sons from society, she was very proactive in telling friends, because she wanted them to know so that their son would still get invited to things and be at parties, but they'd have the necessary food there for them, because they were following a strict diet with Lorenzo's all therapy at the time, and so wanted to ensure that sons could still be invited and partake and have their needs met. I'm just going to skip over these a bit because I'm conscious of time, but people spoke about the responsibility to make progress. They've had this difficult diagnosis. They've been told there's nothing they can do. There's no cure. So what do they do? They just need to do something. So people spoke about fundraising, setting up support groups, getting out there, getting involved in research, whatever it might be, this responsibility to do something where they could. And that their new normal, this time after diagnosis, it all became about protecting, as this participant put it. Your life revolves not just looking after children, but trying to protect them, trying to keep them well. Very, very difficult, very difficult. So yeah, really, really sums up how the diagnosis affected them. And I've spoke a bit about the changing relationships. So to very quickly summarize it, what participants said in general, ALD diagnosis, it created a huge psychological burden for them. Each aspect of the condition brought with it a new challenge. Poor prognosis, the age of onset, the fact that they might have already had other sons, the fear, the guilt associated with the inheritance pattern, the fear associated with the varied expression, all these things that are characteristic of ALD. Together, they kind of produce this scenario of almost overwhelming grief. And despite this really difficult period, they had these new roles and responsibilities kind of bestowed upon them. Most were driven to fulfill these by a duty to protect their relatives, to inform their relatives so that they could maybe go on and get tested and do what they needed to do, and not maybe suffer the same challenges that they themselves were facing. But this was a really difficult task and a really daunting task for most people. It's a two-way thing. It's communication. It was reciprocal. So when relatives responded to this, and maybe in a positive way, it alleviated that burden. But when they didn't, when relatives didn't necessarily agree with how it was being approached, then it exacerbated it. And important, I guess, interestingly, participants didn't. That's my timer. Participants didn't provide any single consensus for how healthcare professionals should best support this process, but they had their own challenges around communication, which kind of required different interventions. So really importantly, what I guess was my takeaway from this for the genetic counselling profession, that, well, clinician support is likely to be most effective when offered in stages, with a shift in focus as patients move forward on their journey. So we very clearly got this period of trauma, of kind of crisis, of real adversity. So genetic counselling perhaps needs to focus on that initially, help families to come to deal with that intense shock, that intense feelings of guilt, trauma, and then moving on from that, start to think about family communication afterwards. Because as we've seen, people spoke about this period as a blur, as a daze. So maybe going into all that detail about how you might help someone communicate with their family, it isn't the best time to do it. Help them to come to terms with that trauma first and reconcile with that. And then maybe at 3, 6, 9, 18 months or whatever, better understand the barriers that people have had with family communication and then shift the focus onto that. And as I've said, the communication challenges themselves that families face were not uniform. There was no single barrier that all families face. So one participant spoke about her difficulty in recalling genetic risk. So she'd been told by her healthcare professionals that the risk to her siblings and nieces and whoever was this. But when she and her husband came to have that conversation with them, she found it difficult. They found it difficult to remember because they'd had a huge amount on their plate, of course, when they received this diagnosis. Another participant talked about how her and her husband, they couldn't agree on whether their second son should have genetic testing, and they would have, in her words, she'd have liked a mediator to kind of help them talk through that. And that's the kind of role that a genetic counsellor can play, to help them, communicate effectively about what might be the best decision for them going forward. And you can see how those two examples, they're both challenges around communication, but they're very different things with very different solutions. So clinicians shouldn't offer a one-size-fits-all approach. We should collaborate with families, and families collaborate with them to understand their own challenges and how they might overcome them. And some people, the burden of being that information bearer, being the person who has found out about this genetic condition, so now by default they've become the messenger. That's too much of a burden, and they really just couldn't cope with that and struggled with that. So maybe a more family-focused approach, group discussions, that kind of thing, where no single person is tasked with that, might be helpful for families going forward. So thank you. I appreciate there's no kind of clear answer in that, but I think it's a really important piece of work just to get down on paper and in published literature the experiences of some families, the difficulties that they face. I appreciate that lots of people watching this may know that, have lived that, and so are acutely aware of that, but to have that out there in a published study for kind of professionals to really see that and understand that, and consider the ways in which families might be better supported in the future. I hope you agree that's a useful piece of research for Alex TLC and for the community moving forward. Thank you for your time.